Next, we will go through creating a pivot table. Commonly called a pivot table, but it is a pivot table. The word is to pivot. So, a lot of people find pivot tables to be difficult. I do not share that notion. And I think people overcomplicate them in their minds because they look quite intimidating. There are a couple of different ways to create pivot tables. We have got 2 tasks here covering them, and we will use both ways to create the pivot table. So, first way, and both ways are very, very similar. The first way is this. So, using the data on the tab Pivot Data, insert a pivot table beginning in cell A12 with the following criteria. So I'm saying that I want the pivot table to start in this cell. And this is the criteria that the pivot table will be filled with. So first things first, I'm selecting the cell that I want the pivot to be in, and I'm going to insert. And then from insert, you will have pivot table automatically. Click it. So the first part of the task, or rather the second part of the task here, of inserting the pivot table into cell A12 is already done. Down here, you see existing worksheet, pivot task 1, A12. If you just wanted your pivot table to be on a new worksheet altogether, you would just click new worksheet. Now we need to select the table range. So by clicking on this little arrow here, it takes you to the box which you can then select your range from. So from here, I just go to pivot table. You must always, always ensure that every column of data in a pivot table has a header. If any of these rows or columns, so if any of the columns in row 1 are blank, the pivot table will not work, though it will give you an error message telling you that all pivots tables must contain header rows or something, and then you know that that's what's missing. Anyway, select all headers and then tab down, and I've selected all the data, just checking there's no data underneath, exactly, and then I press enter to open this back up. Now, I know that I've selected the entire data range, and I know that I've told it where I want it to go, so I'm happy. So I'm just going to press OK and ignore everything else on screen. Now we have the basic pivot table fields, but at the moment the report is not built, and so we need to do that. Over here, this is the pivot table field builder. The first section that you see, all of these here are the header rows. So from row 1 in the pivot table data sheet, these are all the header row names. Now, down here, these are the pivot table fields, and depending on what you have in which of these boxes will depend on what your pivot table looks like. So, as I've said up here, we want the columns to be type. So where we have columns here, we're going to drag type. Next, for the values, we want it to be gross. Now, you will notice I've put values and then I've got brackets for sum of. So this has luckily defaulted to say sum of gross. If I select the arrow and then click on value field settings, what you will see is that there are a number of other options. The most commonly used is the sum of. However, it will often default to count. And so in order to change it, you would select the arrow, select value field settings, and then you would click sum from the list. If I wanted to change this from sum of gross to count of gross, I would just click that. You'll see here it says count of gross, and I'd press OK. We don't want to do that. We want to leave it as sum, and so I'm just going to press OK. And then finally, for rows, I want you to include the name. So Oh, if I drag that into rows, there we go. So we can see for David, the amount that he is cancelled and is held for dispute, the amount that's been charged back, the amount of fees reversed, the amount in the general currency, the amount that's being held for dispute, and so on. Now, the data that we've used here is completely fictitious, and so it is not real. There are many, many, many different uses for pivot tables. A common one that we use internally within the business is that we pivot the agent sales database to see the number of sales made by the agents each day. Now, what does that one look like? That looks like this. The rows are the names of the agents, and we have an additional column for rows, which has also got the agent IDs per the database. We then have columns, and the columns are populated with the dates so that we can see the agent sales broken down by day. And the values, which is what falls in between the names and the dates, are the number of sales they made on those days. And that's a much more useful and workable use of a pivot table. Anyway, for pivot task 1, the pivot table is complete. If you wanted to also see the net, the sum of the net for each, you would just drag it down and drop it in. Now what you see is the sum of the gross so you see cancellation of holdback dispute resolutions in columns. There's the sum of the gross, there's the sum of the net. For chargebacks, there's the sum of the gross, there's the sum of the net. Now for most of these, they seem to be the same. But you see over here, the mobile payment, we have a sum of gross and we have a sum of net that are different. So again, this is fictitious and the same for payment refund. And that will be because there are fees being charged. So actually, if you wanted to see the fees, we would do it like that. Not all of them have fees. In fact, that doesn't seem to have worked. Oh, because I dropped it into the wrong place. So there we go. So for payment refund, we've got the sum of gross, sum of net, and the sum of the fees. Now, annoyingly, the signage is different. And so if we try to add them up this way, you see it doesn't add up. But if you was to add the net as a whole number to the fee, you will see it will come back to this 440.31. And so, you know, that is a basic extension of how you might use a pivot table. You might also say for the columns, like I said here, maybe you also want to add the email addresses. Now, because of the data that's used and the fact that it's all fictitious, it's created something pretty ugly. Maybe you'd want to see it that way around instead. So actually, instead of saying the email addresses and then all the different people using the same, you might have a look at it this way around. So you see David, the list of his email addresses and the different amounts associated with each of those, or you can just drag it back up to return as it was. And so that's the most basic way of creating a pivot table. Now, if we look at pivot task 2, you'll see that I've said using the data on the tab pivot data, insert a pivot table on a new sheet with the following criteria. So clicking on the pivot data tab, from anywhere inside of our data field, I go up to insert and I click pivot table. Because I'm already inside a data field or a data table, Excel's not stupid and it will try to help you and minimize the amount of work you have to do. So what it has automatically done is it has automatically selected all the data that appears in the table. So, for example, if at the bottom of this data here, you had, let's say, 10 blank rows before you continued with additional data that you wanted to incorporate in your pivot, this auto selection would have stopped where the first data row ends, and it would not have jumped 10 entirely blank rows to the next set of data. So you would need to manually adjust the table range by just reselecting the data if that was the case. I don't ever really see that happening. Typically, your data will appear in one complete list with no gaps. Now, it also defaults to open on the new worksheet, which we do want. If you wanted to specify a place for the pivot table on an existing worksheet, you would just select existing worksheet and then go find the location by clicking on that arrow and then going to the tab and clicking on it. We don't want to do that. We just want to click new worksheet and then OK. Now, the annoying thing is the instructions are now on a separate tab. So for this one, we actually also want to use a filter. And the filter is going to be on status. So first things first, I'm going to find status in the field list and I'm going to drop it into filter. Now, in the brackets, it says select completed only. So at the moment, the filter shows all. What you're going to do is you're going to say select multiple items. Then you're going to tick all to unselect them all, and you're just going to retick completed and press OK. Now we know criteria 1 is done. Item 2 or criteria 2 is for rows, and we want to put item title in the rows. So item title, select and drag into rows. Criteria 3 is we want values gross. But as you will notice, I say that I want the count of the values. So click back in the pivot table. By the way, when you select an area outside the pivot table, it closes the field list. Select anywhere in the pivot table to show the field list again. You can also right click when in a pivot table to hide the field list. I wouldn't recommend doing that unless your pivot table is complete. Otherwise, when you need to make changes, so add columns and amounts, you're going to need to show the field list. So next is the values. So in values, we want gross, which is here. So just going to select and drag. We don't want it to be the sum of the gross. We want it to be count. So we select this value field settings and we change it to count. What that means is it's going to tell us the number of times that we have an amount in gross for this item title. So for example, the item title account fees only has a value 3 times in gross. I can prove that. If we go to the pivot table data, we've already got a filter on and we filter for just account fees on the account title column. What you see is in the gross, we have a count of 3. Okay, so that is how the pivot table is working. If that was sum of gross and not count of gross, we will see the amount 5827. 5827. Just to demonstrate, I'm just going to very quickly change this over to sum. 5827. However, as we know, we don't want the sum, we want the count. Now we have one final thing to do, and for the columns, we want it to show the date. So find date, drag it into the columns. Now, this has already defaulted and broke it out as months and dates. As you will see, I have said here that I want it to break it down by month. If I had said day, what I would ask you to do would be to move the date up in that list and you can remove the month altogether. Excel takes and pivot tables do take practice in terms of figuring out how all the different things work. So to get it to show by months, I'm not interested in seeing it by date at any point. You just drag that second part out and it disappears. Now, you can see down here, it's got months selected. If you want to pull in extra fields from date, you just drag it back down again, but we don't want that. So in terms of pivot task 2, we are now complete. So that is, in a nutshell, very basic Excel pivot table. There can be a lot more to it, as I said. There are different ways of laying it out. As your role and your need for the pivot tables grows, so will your ability to use the pivot table. And that is the end of the pivot table tutorial.